Does the Holy Roman Empire still exist on some level, having never been formally abolished? If the empire were to be restored today, who would be the logical man to lead it?
What a good question. Well, first, let me read you a couple of quotes, which I think are worth reading. Uh, First is from the acknowledged master of the acknowledged master of stuff about the Holy Roman Empire in English, James Viscount Bryce, who, in looking over just this very issue, he said, and I quote, uh, quote, Great Britain had refused in 1806 to recognize the dissolution of the empire, and it may indeed be maintained that in point of law, the empire was never extinguished at all, but lived on as a sort of disembodied spirit. For it is clear that, technically speaking, the abdication of a sovereign destroys only his own rights, and does not dissolve the state over which he presides. Perhaps the Elector of Saxony might legally, as imperial vicar during an interregnum, have summoned the Electoral College to meet and choose a new emperor. And then Klaus Epstein, in the Genesis of German Conservatism, declares, quote, while there is no question that Francis was personally entitled to abdicate a crown he was no longer willing to wear, he certainly had no constitutional power to dissolve the fabric of imperial obligation per se. The empire, like all sovereign states, was intended to be perpetual, and the emperor had sworn to maintain it to the best of his ability. He broke his coronation oath when he declared it dissolved, and he failed to consult the Stände assembled at Regensburg about his highly irregular procedure. One can argue, therefore, that the imperial death warrant was technically ultra vires, and therefore null and void, and that the empire, quote unquote, legally continued to exist after 1806. Now, Father Aidan Nichols, my favorite living theologian, has made his comment here in Christendom Awake. Quote, Catholicism, as orthodoxy, has historically regarded the monarchical institution in this light, raised up by Providence to safeguard the natural law in its transmission through history as that norm for human coexistence, which, founded as it is on the Creator and renewed by Him as the Redeemer, cannot be made subject to the positive law or administrative fiat or the dictates of cultural fashion. Let us dare to exercise a Christian political imagination on an as yet unspecifiable future. The articulation of the foundational natural and Judeo-Christian norms of a really united Europe, for instance, would most appropriately be made by such a crown, whose legal and customary relations with the national peoples would be modeled on the best aspects of historic practice in the Western Holy Roman Empire and the Byzantine Commonwealth, to use the term popularized by Professor Dmitry Obolensky. Such a crown, as the integrating factor of an international European Christendom, would leave intact the functioning of parliamentary government in the republican or monarchical polities of its constituent nations and analogues in city and village in other representative and participatory forms. All right, so what does all this mean in terms of our question? Well, let's go back first to the beginning. And by that, what do I mean by the beginning? I mean Maundy Thursday, the first Holy Thursday, when Christ did a number of things. He founded the Mass and the priesthood, but he did something else. He united his Davidic kingship, to which he was the rightful heir, humanly speaking, to the communio of the church. Now, for the first several hundred years of the church's existence, this didn't mean a lot. But starting in 303, when Armenia converted from the king on down, it made a difference. This connection between the church and the Christian state as separate and distinct realities, but nevertheless part of the same thing, the Res Publica Christiana, the body of Christendom. This came to a head in 380 with the Edict of Thessalonica, when Emperor Theodosius the Great made baptism not only entrance into the Catholic Church, but also Roman citizenship. From that time, the idea of the Christian Empire, the Holy Empire, although it encompassed the barbarian kingdoms in the West, the Franks, the Visigoths, the Anglo-Saxons, and so on, all of whom considered themselves part of the empire, even after it ended in 476 AD. They all recognized the emperor at Constantinople as being the chief sovereign of Christendom, although they ran their own affairs. After the Muslims invaded the Near East and took the Holy Land and Egypt and all that, and the Lombards made Byzantine control of Italy very spotty, the Pope looked for another protector, and he turned to the Franks, and he crowned Charlemagne as the renewed emperor in the West. And there emerged what they were pleased to call the two emperors problem. You had the Holy Roman Emperor and the Byzantine Emperor, both claiming to be the successor to the Roman Emperor. But you see, Roman history already provided for that, because for many decades there had been two emperors, one in the West, one in the East, before Theodosius the Great, who was the last emperor to rule both sides and whose sons were emperors in the East and West. But despite having two emperors, it was held to be one empire, coterminous with Christendom. Now, mind you, as France became more powerful, many French kings made the declaration that the King of France within France had the same powers as the emperor outside. And of course, Charlemagne was numbered the first French king, as he was the first Holy Roman Emperor. But here's the fun part. When Charles V in 1517 stood for emperor in the election of that year, his two opponents, his rivals, were King Francis I of France and Henry VIII of England, thus tacitly accepting the fact that although sovereign within their own borders, they were still part of the empire, still part of the Res Publica Christiana. The Reformation comes along. Henry VIII declares his independence not just from the church, but also from the empire.
He said that?
Yeah. And of course, with the Protestant revolt in Northern Europe, and especially Northern Germany and Switzerland, the Netherlands, the imperial power became severely attenuated. But nevertheless, the legality and the tradition remain the same. Now, in 1453, the Byzantium fell to the Turks, and the Byzantine Empire was at last extinguished. But through a marriage negotiated by the then Pope, for all of my Orthodox friends, it was a Catholic Pope who arranged for this, the niece of the last Byzantine emperor married the Grand Duke of Moscow, who from that time on claimed to be the successor of Byzantium and the Tsar. Hence the phrase Moscow as the third Rome. They said that Rome fell to the barbarians and Constantinople to the Turks. Moscow is the third Rome, and there shall not be another. That whole third Rome thing comes again from the imperial tradition. The Holy Roman Empire limped along until in 1806, as we see, was quote unquote dissolved. I say quote unquote because I think the case has been well made that it was not legally so, and that indeed, although there was no Holy Roman Emperor, the empire in the West continued the way it had between 476 and 800, in theory, in legality, and as part of the Respublica Christiana. So, the other thing, of course, that the Emperor Franz did 2 years before his abdication was to create the Empire of Austria so he could maintain an imperial title. And of course, the double eagle and all the rest of it, which had been the symbol of the Christian Roman Empire, continued to be used by the Habsburgs as it was by the Russian Tsars. First the Rurikids, then the Romanovs. In 1917, the last Tsar was overthrown, murdered a year later. In 1918, the last Emperor of Austria was driven from his country. He dies in 1922 in Madeira, the Blessed Emperor Karl. It's interesting to me that Blessed Emperor Karl and Nicholas II are both venerated as saints by their respective churches. And that brings us to the present. Well, I suspect that the Holy Roman Empire is, as it were, the Roman Empire, the Christian Roman Empire, is waiting in the wings to be revived, resuscitated, even along the lines that Father Nicholas suggests. Someday or other, sooner or later, the double eagle shall fly again. What that will look like, I do not know. What realms it shall encompass, who's to say? And of course, it's important to remember that as far as the Holy Roman Empire goes, every Holy Roman Emperor had several different tiers of power. There were his hereditary domains, depending on what dynasty he was from, Habsburg or Hohenstaufen or whatever it might be, where he just ruled. Then there were places like the imperial free cities and the lands of the imperial knights that were feudally subject to him. Then there were the great territorial princes, the electors, and people like that, whose connection was looser. And then there were the Christian sovereigns outside the boundaries of what was called the Holy Roman Empire, who were nevertheless considered to be, and considered themselves to be, part of the empire, which was, as I say, coterminous with Christendom. If, as, and when Catholics, and perhaps Catholics and Orthodox in a reunited church, begin to think along these lines, I have no doubt, as I say, that the empire shall spring to life once more, and the double eagle shall flap its wings. But the last question, who would be the most likely successor? Well, there's no way to tell, of course, if in terms of some remote future. If anything approaching that happened in the more immediate, well, I would say, of course, Karl von Habsburg, the head of the House of Habsburg. But we're a long, long way from that being a possibility. Right now, the church has first to get a pope who really reflects Catholic tradition, because only such a pope would have any interest in this kind of thing at all. It was Leo III who crowned Charlemagne. And of course, you have the interesting and intricate relationship between the popes and the European Catholic sovereigns. In that, on the one hand, his permission was necessary for their coronations. And on the other hand, they had the right of veto over individuals they did not think were appropriate to be pope. So you have this balance between the two.
Speaking of popes who would like that sort of thing, you think we'll ever, in our lifetimes, have a pope who puts on the papal tiara?
A good question. I hope for the sake of the papacy, the Holy See, the Catholic Church, and the world, that happens sooner rather than later. I mean, it all depends, and it all depends on how badly the church and the world gets smacked around by the results of their own sinfulness and stupidity. You know, when you get your face shoved against the wall, you sometimes figure out reality a little more closely than you did before.
So you sound like an accelerationist now.
No, I'm not. I don't want to see it happen, but I'm saying that it will happen sooner or later. I hope not in my time.
But I mean, is that the only way it's going to happen if things quote unquote accelerate?
I think you're looking at it the wrong way. I think they will accelerate, and these things will happen. But it's not that I like it. It's not that I want it, because I don't.
I think I see what you're saying. So we're a train going on the tracks. So it
Yeah,
is happening. This is reality. It's not a matter of if, it just, this is where we are.
yeah. I mean, believe me, if there's a way to slow down the train, I'm all for it. But when you've got morons in charge and everything, it's difficult. Stupidity is not a good thing, despite what you may have heard. Um, I mean, when the Holy Father was vaporing about the Chinese government appointing a bishop, you know, look what you signed with them, Holy Father. Did you have a right of veto in that document? I highly doubt it. You know,
Hmm.
what's to be said? I mean, look, if I give you carte blanche over my bank account, and I give you the right to sign checks on my account solely, and then you empty my account, well, you're a thief. But what am I?